my focus has really been on looking at how work in female-dominated industries, so women, the impact on women and how that intersects with different aspects of women's economic inequality and ultimately leads to lifelong economic inequality. I guess the kind of superannuation angle and the reason why we spend a lot of time looking at this and researching it is that the interesting thing about retirement inequality is it really represents how all these inequalities work together and add up over time. So rather than just a snapshot of this is what pay inequality looks for a 20-year-old, it's okay, by the time a woman gets to the end of her working life, how is this inequality joined together to impact her overall lifelong wealth inequality. And so although sometimes I'll be talking about superannuation, I think thinking about it with the lens of what this is that lifelong wealth inequality. So just to give a bit of a background on how this does sort of come together in retirement inequality, and then I'll focus on the impact of feminised industries or industries that are heavily dominated by females. So there is sort of this perception that retirement inequality is sorting itself out, that overall the issues that older women today are experiencing are going to be much better for younger women. And I think this graph that I've taken from per capita is sort of a good example of why a lot of people think that. And this graph is just really showing that, if we look at baby boomers and what we call the silent generation, so the women who are older than baby boomers, many of whom were not allowed to work at all after they got married, we see really low rates of having any superannuation at all compared to millennials, which overall kind of leads to this perception of, okay, well, younger women are going to be okay. But what we're seeing is that pay inequality and financial inequality is still a big factor that is ultimately leading to that lifelong wealth inequality as well. So if we look on the left, we can see how these inequalities intersect to create retirement saving gap at every age of a woman's life, and you can see that on the right as well. So we know that the pay gap for a graduate, the day she comes out of university into her first job, is currently leading to a super gap of about $500 a year and a pay gap of, I think it's a bit under $6,000 now. So it's kind of prevalent at every age group, and I think that's a really key message and point. So just to kind of show how this is estimated to add up over a lifetime, is that we're still looking at a situation that women who will be retiring in 2040 are still going to have a really significant savings gap compared to men. So if we look at male projected with 12%, that's this light pink line up the top, whereas female is this dark blue line down the bottom. So we're still seeing that going into the future, we're going to see really significant issues. And that's really important because, and I've just pulled some data here, is that we know that older single women, so women who are, if we look at this kind of category here, are far more likely to be on the full pension compared to men. So we see in Australia, this is slightly old data, but we see in Australia that there's about 500 and something thousand single women who are fully reliant on the pension as a key source of income, compared to around 240,000 single men. And the reason why I sort of look at singles is because often there's this argument that it's okay because women have their husband's income in retirement, but we actually see really significant rates of women dependent on that pension. So currently over 80% of women who are expected to retire in the next 5 years will still retire dependent on their partners or dependent on the pension, and obviously many of those people are living below the poverty line. So I guess essentially issues like the economic inequalities that we see through women in feminised industries, but also the inequalities they face in general are still leading to what is going to be a significant issue going forward. So somebody I think asked, actually I saw a question actually asked why is it that women are still getting paid less even in industries that are dominated by women? And so this is just sort of a quick graph so you can kind of get an indicator of how occupational segregation contributes to the gender pay gap. So the dark blue box here is, this sort of the third box along sort of shows the contribution of occupational segregation. And then we see that the purple box here is, what is sort of attributed to just pure gender discrimination. So even within workplaces that are heavily dominated by women, you can still expect some form of gender discrimination. So often, for instance, health's a really classic one, where men tend to be doctors, more likely to be doctors or higher paid health workers, women more likely to be nurses. The same in caring industries where men are far more likely to be managerial level compared to women, but also even within levels you still get pay inequality. So within levels you've still got that general pay discrimination. And then you've also got issues like part-time employment. So I'll talk more about how part-time employment intersects and unpaid and carer work. So I think it's important to consider how these issues kind of work together to form an overall picture of inequality. And this is obviously just the gender pay gap, but you can imagine then how the gender pay gap goes on to impact retirement inequality as well. So this next slide, I won't go through this because I think that this was already touched on. It was just showing the salary differences in male and female dominated industries. But what I wanted to show was this sort of graph that I've actually just stolen from per capita, which shows, I guess, when we're thinking about lifelong financial inequality, the factors that are leading to this, and again, to kind of think about how these factors intersect and what that might mean for policy when we're looking at policy specifically related to industries that are heavily dominated by women. So you've got your gender pay gap. So obviously there's a significant pay gap in those industries. You've got, we've had till very recently no super at all being paid to low pay to people receiving small amounts of money. That's changed. We've got the carer responsibilities. We've got, so women are far more likely to take on unpaid care role, whether that's childcare or other forms of care. I'll go into that more. They're more likely to take on unpaid domestic work. There's also age discrimination that comes into it, and they're more likely to suffer from age discrimination because of time outside of the workforce when they're re-entering. Then you've got issues like unaffordable housing. So again, that really impacts women, particularly at the end of their towards their later years of life, if they've been working in industries that are heavily dominated by women and have suffered pay inequality as a result of that. Women are living longer. There's a cost and availability of childcare, and also greater rates of part-time and casual work. So there's a whole lot of factors here, and to just sort of give an understanding of how that fits in, and I'll talk a bit more about how some of these factors can intersect as well. And one just little note I've just put here in relation to issues in the pay gap and feminised industries is that in Australia, nannies and home workers don't receive any superannuation at all. So that's a good little policy you could just pop in straight away. It's something that's not really talked about. Absolutely sort of bizarre state of policy that you would have this one tiny group of workers that are the only workers in Australia that that don't receive superannuation. So I think when, particularly when we're thinking about the lifelong wealth gap, unpaid workers in the home is really the greatest feminised workforce that there is. So we know that women do far more of the unpaid work compared to men. So I won't go through these statistics, but they're doing on average about 13.3 hours. So men do on average about 13.3 hours of housework and about 5.4 hours of unpaid work looking after children, whereas women are doing about 20 hours of housework and about 11 hours looking after children. So a really significant difference there that is obviously then reflected in workforce participation rates as well. And I think that workforce participation is, if we're talking about like how do these issues intersect and why it is important to think about them, is that when it comes to feminised workplaces, there's the issue of women in all those companies where there are higher rates of women, or those industries where there are higher rates of women having lower pay. But there's also an issue in Australia because we have such terrible rates of workforce participation amongst women that we also see a situation where women who are often overqualified are going into lower roles in heavily dominated, in industries that are heavily dominated women, because they need a level of workforce flexibility that they can't get in other workplaces. So to sort of put more context around how serious the issue is of workforce participation in Australia, you can see in this graph, this just shows the OECD average for part-time work for women. And then you can see Australia at 37% compared to an OECD average of 25%. So really high rates of part-time work. And then if you think about that, a lot of the industries that are heavily dominated by women, it's much easier to get those part-time and casual roles. So we can see that that's why there tends to be a larger grouping, or one of the reasons why you get a larger grouping of women into those industries. And, you know, we've got a situation where some women are estimated to be paying, you know, an effective tax rate of over 100% essentially to re-enter the workforce because of the you know, impacts on family benefits and childcare benefits, etc. So I think it's really important to think about how these issues and other issues intersect together to then cause the final kind of impacts on women. And then I just wanted to, because I think it was another area that wasn't touched on, is just talk specifically about COVID, because I think that there's some kind of really important lessons. And again, you know, a lot of these you would have already heard about and you already know about, but I think just to highlight them again. So we saw that women were really overrepresented in a lot of the service roles, in industries such as accommodation, food services, retail, trade. Many of the casual and part-time jobs have gone, and some of them are not going to return. Some of them have returned, but there's still a lot of instability. And as we all know from the budget that came out, not the most recent budget, but the backlash to the budget the year before it, but also the recent one, is that they're, you know, that money that came in flew through to a lot of these industries that were more heavily dominated by men. And I think one of the really interesting ones on that was childcare, or the lack of inclusion of childcare, free childcare in the budget. And there was just so much great economic modelling from the Australia Institute and other economic think tanks that really showed that, you know, for every $1 million that you invest in free early childhood education, you can create sort of upwards of 6, 7, 8 jobs. And then if you include sort of more indirect jobs, that number even increases. Whereas for $1 million invested in construction, it's sort of like 1 point something jobs, I think it was. So, you know, there was really strong argument for greater investment in some of those industries that were heavily female dominated. And I think that's sort of important to reflect on when we're thinking about policies, about why that they weren't included and why they were invisible. And I think that really touched on some of the comments around just the importance of gender sensitive budgeting or gender responsive budgeting, because I think if we'd been able to see how that investment was going to impact men and women really clearly, I think it would have been really shocking. And I think just some other elements of the response that really demonstrates that. So, you know, one of the really big issues that faced a lot of women, and we saw this in the second lockdown in Melbourne, was that there were additional benefits for small businesses, but you had to have earned over $75,000 in the previous financial year. And again, what we see is when we look at businesses that men versus women own, that the businesses that women tend to run, they're far more likely to be sole traders, and it's far more likely to be a business that they operate part-time. And so we actually saw a huge number of female self-employed women miss out on any form of assistance. And again, I think that was just as a result of, you know, poor gender responsiveness and no sort of understanding of how women were employed in small business. And so I think this is an important sort of area to look at as well. So not just from COVID, but when we're thinking about areas that are heavily dominated by women, women in small self-employed businesses is certainly one. You know, and I think another one was that again, because of how we saw that men were far less likely to reduce their hours compared to women, and also that women, unfortunately, were 50% more likely after COVID to have stopped looking for work at all. So this kind of data has been tricky in how it trickles through into unemployment figures. But a lot of women after COVID have just left the workforce and not returned. And we'll have to see how that comes in the following years. But again, a large proportion of that is because women came out to take on caring roles. And so we need to see how those women can be supported as well. Just to kind of like sort of, I guess, talk through why that is important for superannuation, and when we think about how these wealth inequalities flow through to later years of life. Before taking early release, women between the ages of 24 and 35 had 21% less super savings on average than men. And after just the first release, so remember there was 2 different releases, that same category had 45% less. And so when we're talking about issues of inequality facing women in heavily dominated industries that are heavily dominated by women, we have to think about what are their flow-on effects going to be to later years of life as well, and how can we support them at different periods. So both trying to improve things now, but ensuring that there's some kind of equality later in life so that women who have been impacted can live in comfort. and not in poverty. So just to kind of go through, I guess, a few recommendations or policy things that I think about. So first of all, in terms of that, how does this impact women later in life, and how can we make things a bit fairer? Currently, of the $40 billion in superannuation tax concessions, so 2/3 of it goes to men. So we can see that women who miss out throughout their working lives then also miss out in their later lives. And so a couple of thoughts on that. So retirement benefits to paid to carers. So whether that's unpaid carers or, for unpaid carers. So whether that's carers who are receiving government caring allowances or not. But currently there's no retirement benefit on those. So again, very, very heavily dominated by women, often receiving some form of government payment to get them through, but they're not receiving anything for later in life. We need to see broader efforts to encourage women with children back into the paid workforce so that, and I think this was already touched on before, some of the use it or lose it, paid parental leave for secondary carers. So, I think that was touched on. Free early childhood education has obviously been shown to have a massive impact here. We know that the higher cost of childhood education in Australia is really prohibitive for a lot of women re-entering the workforce or re-entering the jobs that they used to have. I think another one that's important is looking at moving towards schemes where there's equal paid parental leave in organisations for primary and secondary carers. So one of the issues that we have and how the government can support that. So, there's still great concern amongst employers that, if I hire a female worker, that there's a potential much greater cost if that female worker takes time out. And really the only kind of successful way that we've seen of levelling that is in countries where there is greater equality in that leave, so that employers aren't thinking about, if I hire a woman in her late 20s, what's the impact of that on my business going to be, because it will be similar to if they hire a guy in their late 20s who also then decides to take leave. Just include as well that we need social programs that challenge gender norms in the family and the workplace, as being really important to ensuring that women are accepted into some of those heavily male dominated industries, and also that within families there's greater acceptance of, as we've spoken about before, women earning more. I think just another one is just amending the Sex Discrimination Act to allow employers to make higher superannuation payments for female employees if they wish to do so. So I was recently speaking to the CEO of a major fashion retailer in Australia who employs 80% women. They've got thousands of staff in Australia. It's one of the biggest retailers here. They would like a policy where they could pay their female staff a higher rate of superannuation compared to male staff. But in order to do that, you actually need specific permission from the Sex Discrimination Commission. That's not being handed out very readily. It's been a really grey area for a while, so there's a few employees that have got exemptions on that. That's a great policy for allowing employers to help try to support women who have come back into paid work after being out for a significant point of time, or women who are likely to take time out so that they can catch up or be a little bit ahead. I think we need to see that legislative change to, I think Labor has already, they had announced it, I think in the lead up to the last election, to allow pay inequality data from WGEA to be released at a company level. So just to give you some insight, at Verve, something we actually do is we actually invest in companies that that promote gender equality. So we actually, because we know that it's linked to financial returns, so we actually directly use this WGEA data to determine which companies we do and don't invest in. We're at the beginning of a wave that I would hope of other superannuation funds taking this kind of data into more consideration and using it to put pressure on companies in their portfolios. So not only does having that data at a company level support workers to be able to better negotiate, it also supports shareholders, large shareholders, to be able to put pressure on individual companies in a way that we can't do at the moment. I think, again, gender responsive budgeting is obviously really important. I think if we look at, as I said, if you look at the COVID response, it really highlighted that. And also for superannuation modelling. So we really need that in superannuation. We've seen under Howard, we saw huge changes to the superannuation system that essentially has shifted it from a system that was designed to support everyone to retire in comfort to one that, has really been exploited by people who are amongst Australia's top 1% to use it for tax harbouring purposes. Really being able to see how changes to that system impact men and women is really important. And again, I highlight this just because we're looking at how are women who face inequality throughout their lives then supported to actually live comfortably later in life. And often it is later in life that these impacts really start to have major consequences.
Sorry, Christina, I've got to interrupt. We've got to wind up.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm basically done.
Thanks.
Nannies and home workers to receive super, make certain that is in there, and I'm done.